The desert of Virith burned under two suns, their light so fierce it seemed to melt the very air. The sand shimmered in long waves that stretched to the horizon, endless and cruel. Corporal James Rowe walked slowly, each step sinking deep into the hot dunes. His boots were worn, his clothes heavy with dust, and his throat dry from days without rest. He had been stranded since the crash, a single survivor in a sea of gold and heat. He lifted his canteen and shook it. A few drops rattled inside, mocking him. It was not enough to last another day. The nearest signal station was far beyond the mountains, and the transmitter in his suit had burned out when his ship went down. Still he kept walking. That was what soldiers did, they kept moving. The suns glared from above like twin eyes of fire. The sky was a pale orange haze. James's vision blurred as he trudged on, sweat dripping into his eyes. He thought he saw shapes moving in the distance, shadows that came and went, tricks of the heat. He blinked and kept going. He could not afford to stop. If he rested, he might never rise again. But then he heard it. A sound, faint and broken, carried on the hot wind. It was not the howl of a storm or the hiss of sand. It was a voice, small, weak and trembling. He froze. At first he thought it was his mind playing tricks. He had been alone for too long. But then he heard it again, a whimper. Please, help. James turned his head, scanning the dunes. The sun's glare blinded him for a moment, then his eyes adjusted, and he saw a small shape half buried in the sand. He stumbled toward it, his legs heavy, his breath short. As he drew closer he realized it was a child, or at least something like one. Its body was covered in dull, cracked scales, once bright but now faded from heat. Small wings were pressed tight against its back, and its tail barely moved. The creature's face was narrow, with golden eyes that flickered weakly in the light. A dragon child. James had heard of them. The species of Dracarans, proud, powerful, and fierce. They had been enemies of humankind for generations. The war had burned across star systems. Yet here one of their young lay dying in the sand, small and helpless. The child tried to lift its head but could not. Its lips, if they could be called that, were dry and cracked. Please, sir, it whispered again, voice rough and thin. Just one sip of water. James stood still for a long time, looking at the canteen in his hand. It was nearly empty. The water inside could keep him alive a little longer. He had no way of knowing how far the next outpost was or whether rescue would ever come. But then he looked back at the creature. It was barely breathing now, its chest rising weakly. Its claws dug faintly into the sand as if holding on to life itself. James knelt beside it. The heat burned his knees through his trousers, but he didn't care. He unscrewed the lid of the canteen and held it out. Here, he said quietly. The child blinked at him, confused. But, you are human. I know, he said. Now drink. The dragon hesitated, then reached out with trembling claws. It took the canteen carefully as if afraid it might vanish. Slowly it tipped it to its mouth and drank. The sound of those few drops being swallowed seemed louder than the wind itself. When the canteen was empty, James took it back. The child's eyes met his, brighter now but still weak. Why? It asked softly. James sighed. Because you asked. The dragon blinked again as if the answer did not make sense. Its tail moved slightly, brushing against his boot. Thank you, it whispered. He nodded. You're welcome. For a while they sat in silence. The suns lowered slightly and the wind picked up, blowing lines across the dunes. James tore a strip from his sleeve and wet it with what little sweat he could muster, then pressed it gently against the child's face to cool it. What's your name? He asked. Tarek, the child murmured. I ran away. The soldiers came to my home. There was fire. My mother told me to fly, but my wings are small. I fell. James looked at the torn scales and the small, fragile wings. They were blistered by heat. The child had probably walked until it couldn't anymore. You did well to make it this far, he said. You're brave. Tarek gave a tiny smile, his fangs barely showing. Humans don't call us brave, he said weakly. James looked at the horizon. Humans call a lot of things by the wrong name. The wind grew colder as the suns dipped lower. James knew they had to find shelter before night. The temperature in the desert dropped sharply after dark, and the storms that followed could bury them alive. He stood, his body aching, and looked around. To the west he saw a rise of rocks that might offer cover. Can you walk? He asked. Tarek tried to stand, wobbling slightly. I can try. James nodded and offered his hand. The dragon's small claw gripped his fingers tightly, rough but warm. Together they walked slowly toward the rocks, leaving a trail of footprints behind them. By the time they reached shelter, the suns had fallen behind the horizon. The night came quickly and the first stars began to shine above. James sat against the rocks, exhausted. Tarek curled beside him, tail wrapped around his legs for warmth. The stars shimmered faintly in the dark sky. For the first time since the crash, James did not feel completely alone. He looked at the empty canteen lying beside him and smiled faintly. "Guess that's gone," he said. Tarek opened one eye, sleepy but content. "You gave me life," he said softly. "Someday I will give it back." James chuckled quietly. "You just focus on staying alive tonight, all right?" The dragon nodded and closed his eyes. The wind howled across the dunes, but in their small corner of the desert, there was peace. A human and a dragon, two enemies sharing the same silence, the same stars, and one simple truth: sometimes kindness was stronger than war. And as the night deepened, James found himself staring at the stars above, wondering if perhaps fate had brought them together for a reason. He did not know it yet, but this small act, a sip of water, a choice of mercy, would one day change the destiny of two worlds. When the sun set, the sand cooled and the world turned silver under the light of two moons. The desert was quiet except for the soft whisper of wind and the crackle of cooling stone. James Rose sat near a small rock wall, watching the faint shimmer of heat fade from the dunes. Beside him, the small dragon child stirred for the first time since drinking the last of his water. The boy blinked slowly, his golden eyes reflecting the starlight. He lifted his head, weak but awake, and looked at the human who had saved him. His voice was soft, hesitant. "My name is Tarek," he said. James gave a small nod. "Tarek," he repeated. "Good name. I'm James." There was a long silence. The child shifted his wings a little, wincing at the cracks along their edges. His scales glowed faintly in the moonlight, no longer dull but still dry and fragile. Finally Tarek whispered, "You're a human. You shouldn't help me. We're enemies." James looked at him, then smiled faintly. "Not out here, we're not." Tarek tilted his head, confused. "But the war." "The war's far away from here," James said simply. "Right now it's just us, a man, a dragon, and a lot of sand." The dragon blinked, unsure whether to believe him. He curled his tail close, still watching carefully. James understood that look. It was the look of someone who had been told all his life who he was supposed to fear. He had worn that same look himself years ago when the first battles had begun. James tore a piece of his sleeve and tied it around Tarek's burned arm. "This should help a little," he said. "We'll find water tomorrow. There has to be some near the cliffs." Tarek's wings twitched. "Why do you care?" James leaned back against the rock, staring up at the twin moons. "Because no one else will," he said quietly. "And because I've seen enough dying." The boy said nothing for a while. He looked down at the torn cloth around his arm and traced it with one claw. "Humans hurt my people," he said softly. "They burn our nests. My mother said never to trust them." James sighed. "And humans are told dragons are monsters. Guess we've both been lied to." Tarek looked up at him again, his eyes wide. "Then why help me?" James smiled slightly. "Because you asked." The boy didn't answer, but he didn't turn away either. His gaze softened, and for the first time since meeting him, James saw the child behind the scales, frightened, lost, and alone. They sat quietly for a while. The wind carried the sound of shifting dunes, and the air smelled faintly of dust and salt. James looked up at the stars, strange constellations he didn't recognize. Somewhere up there, he thought, Earth might still be spinning far beyond this red sky. "Where's your home?" he asked. Tarek's tail moved slowly in the sand. "Far north," he said. "Near the Blue Mountains. My mother said they touched the sky." James smiled faintly. "Sounds beautiful." "It was," Tarek whispered. "But the fire ships came. They dropped bombs from the clouds. Everything burned." James looked down. "I'm sorry." The boy looked at him, surprised. "You're sorry?" "Yeah," James said. "Even if I wasn't the one who did it. It shouldn't have happened." For a long time they said nothing. Then Tarek's small voice broke the silence. "Do you have a family?" James hesitated. "I did," he said. "My wife's name was Claire. She stayed behind when I joined the fleet. I haven't seen her in 3 years." The boy tilted his head. "Do you miss her?" "Every day." Tarek looked at the stars again. "Then maybe you can go home too." James smiled softly. "Maybe. But right now, I think my job is making sure you get home first." The young dragon blinked, then lowered his head, hiding a small smile. "You sound like my father." "Was he kind?" James asked. Yes, Tarek said. He told stories about humans, before the war. He said once, long ago, humans and dragons built the sky roads together. I didn't believe him. James looked toward the horizon. Maybe he was right. Maybe we just forgot. The desert grew colder. James pulled his coat tighter and motioned for Tarek to move closer to the small heat lamp from his survival kit. The little device hummed softly, glowing orange. Tarek stretched his claws toward it, feeling warmth for the first time in days. Tomorrow, James said, we'll head east. If I remember right, there should be an old mining site not too far from here. There might still be water or supplies. Tarek nodded sleepily. You know where you're going? Not really, James admitted. But pretending helps. Tarek chuckled quietly, a soft, low sound that almost didn't seem real. It made James smile. The wind howled gently across the dunes, carrying the scent of faraway storms. James lay back on the sand, staring at the stars. He felt the exhaustion pull at him, but his mind was strangely calm. The fear that had clung to him since the crash had eased, replaced by something lighter. Beside him, Tarek curled up tightly, tail around his legs, small wings folded. His breathing slowed as he drifted toward sleep. Before closing his eyes completely, he whispered, "Thank you, James." James looked down at him, smiling faintly. "You're welcome, kid." He reached for his empty canteen and placed it beside the boy. The metal glinted faintly in the moonlight, a quiet reminder of the choice he'd made. As the night deepened, the desert grew still. James felt his eyes grow heavy. He thought about his wife, his home, and the strange twist of fate that had brought him here, saving the life of a creature he had once been told to fear. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, if rescue would ever come or if this barren planet would become their grave. But as he drifted off to sleep, he felt a strange peace. The stars above them shimmered like 1,000 eyes watching over man and dragon alike, and for the first time the endless war between their kinds felt far away, small beneath the quiet sky. James Rowe, human soldier, and Tarek, the dragon child, slept side by side under the cold moons of Virith, bound not by blood or species, but by something much greater, the simple, unspoken kindness that can bridge even the oldest divide. The days that followed were long and hard. The desert showed no mercy. Each sunrise brought heat like fire, and every night froze the air until it bit the skin. James Rowe walked with heavy steps, his vision blurry, his throat burning from thirst. The small dragon child, Tarek, walked beside him, wings drooping, tail dragging behind. They had no water left. The last drop from the canteen had gone to Tarek 2 days ago. James didn't regret it, but his body was failing. Every breath felt like breathing fire. "Keep moving," he said weakly, though his voice cracked. "There has to be something ahead." Tarek stopped and looked back. His golden eyes were dull with worry. "You can't walk anymore," he said. "You're falling." James gave a faint laugh. Maybe just tired. He took another step, then his legs gave out. The sand met his knees, then his chest. The heat pressed down like a weight. "James?" Tarek shouted. He ran to him, small claws sinking into the hot sand. The dragon boy tried to pull the man up, but James was too heavy. "Go on," James whispered. "Find shelter." Tarek shook his head fiercely. "No. I won't leave you." The wind rose suddenly, a low roar sweeping through the dunes. A sandstorm was coming fast, a wall of red dust rolling across the desert like a living beast. Tarek looked around wildly. He could barely see through the haze. Then through the swirling grit he spotted something, the broken tail of a metal ship, half buried in the sand. "There?" he cried. He pulled at James's arm with all his strength. The human groaned but tried to help, crawling inch by inch. The wind cut their faces, the sand stinging like knives. "Almost there." Tarek shouted over the storm. When they finally reached the wreck, Tarek found a gap in the metal, a doorway half broken, leading into darkness. He pushed James inside, then followed, falling to the floor beside him. The storm screamed outside, shaking the old walls, but inside it was still. James lay on his back, breathing hard. Sweat and sand clung to his face. "Good job," he said softly. Tarek looked around. The air smelled like rust and dust. Bits of old tech littered the floor, shattered screens, faded signs, cables like vines. It must have been a transport ship once, long forgotten by time. The dragon boy found a cracked container in the corner and tore it open. Inside was a small ration pack, dry but sealed. He sniffed it, unsure, then brought it to James. "Eat," he said. James smiled faintly. "You first." "You need it more," Tarek said, frowning. James shook his head. "We share." So they did. The dry food tasted like sand, but it gave them strength. When they finished, Tarek curled up near the wall, wings folded tight. He looked at the man who had saved him and whispered, "You gave me your water." "Why?" James closed his eyes for a moment before answering. "Because you were dying." "But now you might die," Tarek said softly. "That's not fair." James gave a small laugh. "Fair doesn't matter much out here." The boy frowned and looked down. "In my clan the strong protect the weak. But you're weak now. So I will protect you." James opened one eye, smiling. "Deal." The storm outside grew louder, howling through the cracks in the hull. Bits of sand blew in, glittering like dust in the dim light. Tarek stood up and walked to the door. His wings caught the wind, and he pushed the metal shut with a grunt. When he turned back, James was shaking. His skin was pale and his lips were cracked. Tarek's chest tightened with fear. He searched the ship again, clawing through broken crates until he found a small emergency box. Inside there was a clear tube filled with something that looked like liquid. He sniffed it, then rushed to James. "Drink?" he asked. James took a weak look at it. "Coolant, not water," he said faintly. "It'll make me sick." Tarek looked down, clutching the tube. His small claws trembled. "Then what do I do?" James reached out and touched his shoulder. "Just stay," he whispered. "That's enough." The boy sat beside him. His tail wrapped around James's arm, and he began humming softly, the same lullaby his mother once sang when storms came. Outside, the storm roared on for hours. Inside, the boy hummed and the man drifted between sleep and wakefulness. At one point, James opened his eyes and whispered, "You remind me of my son." Tarek looked up. "You have a son?" "Had," James said quietly. "He'd be your age now." The dragon child leaned closer. "What happened?" "The war," James said, his voice barely a whisper. The boy said nothing more. He understood enough. He pressed his small head against James's arm, his scales cool against the man's skin. "Then I'll be your son now," he said simply. James blinked, surprised, then smiled weakly. "You already are, kid." The storm began to fade. The howling turned to a soft wind and the sand settled. Through a crack in the ceiling, a beam of light shone down, warm and gold. Tarek looked up. "It's morning," he said. "The storm's gone." James sat up slowly, wincing, but he managed to smile. "Then let's find that water, huh?" The boy nodded. He helped the man stand, his small wings fluttering for balance. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, but it looked softer now, less like an enemy, more like a challenge. Together, they stepped out of the wreck, leaving footprints side by side. The sun rose over the dunes, turning the world gold. James shaded his eyes and said, "You lead the way this time." Tarek grinned, his eyes bright again. "Yes, Dad." James chuckled. "Still getting used to that." They started walking toward the far cliffs, where the wind carried the faint scent of moisture. Behind them, the wreck lay silent, a grave of the past. Ahead of them, hope waited, fragile but alive. In the endless desert of Virith, a soldier and a dragon child walked together. No longer enemies, no longer strangers, but survivors bound by the simplest of promises, to keep each other alive. The sound of engines echoed across the desert before the patrol ship appeared. A long shadow crossed the dunes as the craft descended, kicking up waves of sand. James and Tarek shielded their faces from the wind. The small dragon clutched James's sleeve nervously. When the doors opened, human soldiers poured out, their armor gleaming in the sunlight, rifles raised and aimed straight at them. "Get away from that dragon," the leader shouted. His voice was sharp and commanding. James stood slowly, his body weak but steady. He lifted his hands. "Hold your fire," he called back. "He's just a kid." The soldiers hesitated but did not lower their weapons. The leader, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, narrowed his eyes. "That thing is an enemy combatant," he said coldly. "Step aside, Corporal." James took a shaky breath and stood his ground. "You'll have to shoot through me first." The silence that followed was tense. The desert wind whistled between them, carrying grains of sand that sparkled in the harsh light. Tarek pressed closer behind James, trembling. The leader frowned. "You're protecting it? Are you insane?" James shook his head. "He's a child, sir. He saved my life." The soldiers murmured among themselves. One of them whispered, "That's impossible." Another said, "They burn everything they touch." Tarek flinched, his claws digging into the sand. James heard the fear in his breathing. He looked over his shoulder and spoke softly. "It's okay, Tarek. They just don't understand." The leader sighed and raised his weapon higher. "Step away, Corporal. That's an order." James looked him in the eye. "With respect, sir," he said, "I can't." The man's jaw tightened. "You're risking a court-martial." James gave a small, tired smile. "I've risked worse." The soldiers shifted uneasily. They weren't sure what to do. None of them had ever seen a human stand between one of their own and a dragon. Tarek slowly peeked from behind James. His eyes met the soldiers, not fierce, not glowing, just scared and tired. He swallowed and spoke in a trembling voice. "Please, don't hurt him. He's my friend." The words hung in the air. Simple. Honest. A few of the soldiers lowered their weapons slightly. The leader, however, kept his rifle steady. "Friend," he repeated like it was a word he'd never heard before. "Dragons don't make friends with humans." James turned to him. "Maybe they do now." The leader's expression changed. There was something in James's voice, quiet but unbreakable. He looked past the soldier and saw the truth. Two survivors covered in dust and sweat, both clinging to life, neither one a threat. He hesitated. "You're sure the creature didn't force you?" James shook his head. "No force. Just kindness." Tarek stepped forward slowly, wings tucked tight against his back. "He gave me his water," the boy said softly. "All of it." A murmur went through the soldiers again. Even the leader's hard stare began to soften. "Why?" the leader asked, almost to himself. "Because I asked," Tarek answered. No one spoke after that. The desert was silent except for the hum of the ship's engines. The leader finally lowered his rifle. "Stand down," he ordered quietly. The others obeyed, some still confused, others relieved. James let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Tarek. "See? They just needed to hear the truth." Tarek nodded, but he was still shaking. They were going to shoot." James crouched down beside him. "Yeah," he said softly. "Sometimes people fear what they don't know. But fear can change." The leader approached, his boots crunching in the sand. He looked down at the dragon boy, then at James. "We can take you both back to base. You'll be questioned, but you'll be safe." James nodded. "We'll come." Tarek looked unsure. "They don't want me." "They will," James said. "They just don't know it yet." The soldiers stepped aside as the two walked toward the ship. Some watched in silence. Others looked away, uneasy. The leader followed them, muttering into his comms. "Prepare medical for 2 survivors," he said. 1 human, 1 juvenile dragon. Inside the patrol ship, the air was cool and clean. James sank into a seat, exhausted. Tarek sat across from him, claws fidgeting. "Do they hate me?" he asked. James looked at him and smiled gently. "They're scared. It's different. But fear fades. You'll see." The ship lifted off, the engines rumbling beneath them. Through the small window, the endless desert shrank below, the dunes glowing like gold. Tarek stared out in silence for a while. "You could have let them take me," he said quietly. "You could have gone home." James leaned back, eyes half closed. "Home wouldn't mean much without you, kid." Tarek looked down, unsure what to say. Then he whispered, "You're strange for a human." James laughed softly. "You're strange for a dragon." The boy smiled for the first time in days. When the ship entered the upper atmosphere, the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky deep red. James dozed off, his head resting against the wall. Tarek watched him quietly, his small wings fluttering in the soft air. For the first time he felt something he'd never felt before, safe. Not because he was strong, not because he was a dragon, but because someone cared. And somewhere deep inside, the boy decided that no matter where they went, no matter what humans thought of him, he would stay with the man who had given him everything, even when he had nothing left. Outside, the stars began to appear, distant, bright, and endless, watching over a soldier and a dragon who had chosen to believe in each other. Weeks passed, and what began as a quiet rescue in the desert of Virith became a story that crossed stars. People whispered it on transport ships, in colony markets, and across military stations. A human soldier had saved a dragon child, and the dragon child had saved him back. It was simple, unbelievable, and yet it was true. James Rowe and Tarek were moved to the capital base on Terra Nova. Reporters and council envoys came to see them, curious about the impossible friendship that had formed in the wastelands. The two became symbols of something no one thought could exist: peace between their kinds. Tarek stayed close to James during the long questioning sessions. He didn't like the bright lights or the cold, echoing rooms. Whenever the officers asked about what happened, James spoke slowly, clearly, always honest. "I didn't save a dragon," he would say. "I saved a boy." The Council of Worlds gathered in the Great Chamber, a place where no dragon or human had stood together in 100 years. Holograms of leaders from across the colonies flickered in the air, their voices sharp, their opinions louder than reason. One side wanted punishment, saying a human had broken military law. The other demanded proof that dragons could be trusted. The arguments went on for days. James didn't care much for politics. He sat in the courtyard outside with Tarek, watching the twin moons rise. "They'll argue until their throats go dry," he said with a small smile. Tarek looked up. "Will they stop fighting?" James thought for a moment. "Maybe," he said. "Sometimes peace takes time. Sometimes it takes a story." The next morning they were summoned to speak before the full council. The chamber was filled with humans, dragons, and diplomats of other species, all watching. James walked in slowly, wearing his torn desert uniform, the same one he'd worn when he found Tarek. The dragon boy followed, his small wings folded neatly, eyes wide with awe and fear. The head counselor, an older woman with silver hair, leaned forward. "Corporal Rowe," she said, "you risked your life for an enemy? Why?" James looked at her calmly. "Because he was dying," he said. "Because war doesn't make a child any less a child." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. The woman turned her gaze to Tarek. "And you, young one? Why did you save the human when you could have escaped?" Tarek hesitated, then said softly, "He gave me his water. No one ever did that before." There was silence again, deep and still. For a moment even the hum of the air vents seemed to stop. Then, slowly, one of the dragon delegates stood. He looked old, his scales pale blue and his eyes thoughtful. "Water is life," he said. "And life shared between enemies becomes something greater, trust." That moment changed everything. Talks began again, but this time they were quieter. Voices softened. Papers were signed. The great chamber filled not with shouting, but with the sound of pens scratching against treaties. When it was done, the council leader announced the name of the new peace, the Water Accord. Across the colonies people celebrated. Soldiers on both sides lowered their weapons. Families that had been divided by the long war sent messages across light years. It wasn't perfect peace, nothing ever is, but it was a beginning. Tarek and James watched the fireworks from the balcony of their quarters. The night sky glowed with color. The boy's eyes reflected the light like twin stars. "Do you think it will last?" Tarek asked quietly. James nodded slowly. "It will, as long as people remember why it started." "And why did it start?" the boy asked. James smiled. "Because someone asked for a sip of water." Tarek laughed softly, a sound that warmed the air. "And someone gave his whole canteen." The two stood there for a long time, the wind cool against their faces. Below them, people of every kind, human and dragon alike, walked side by side through the plaza, celebrating the fragile peace they now shared. In time, statues were built, not of generals or kings, but of a tired soldier handing a canteen to a small dragon. Beneath the sculpture were simple words carved in stone. "Kindness is stronger than war." Years later, when James grew older and slower, Tarek never left his side. He called the human Dad, and though some still whispered about their strange friendship, most had come to see it as proof that peace was not a dream. One day, as the sun rose over the shining towers of Terra Nova, Tarek stood at the same balcony where they had once watched the fireworks. The air smelled of rain, and the golden light bathed the city below. He whispered softly to himself, "He gave me water, and I gave him hope." And far away, across the red deserts of Virith where it had all begun, the wind carried the memory of that act, one small kindness that had changed the fate of worlds. The story of the man and the dragon became legend, told to every child who asked how peace began. And every time it was told, the words stayed the same. He didn't give him a sip. He gave him everything. The end.